Alright, the final thing we're going to do is we're actually going to implement these in a class. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new Xcode project. I'm going to choose application. I'm going to choose just a single view. We could just do these as like a application in OS 10 or else kind of a simple Objective-C, but we'll do the iPhone type app. I'm going to change my device to iPhone, and I'm going to call this Quadro Copter. I'm going to choose next, and I'm going to go ahead and create this. So this is where it's going to save it. And we have our base class. So what we want to do is implement this interface. So this interface shows us kind of what's going on with the program. And it doesn't really show us how to implement it. It just lets us know, hey, we need to create a hover method, move direction, that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and first create the motor object. So I'm going to shrink this down just a little bit. And I'm going to right click on here. I'm going to do a new file. It's going to be Objective-C class. It's going to be a subclass of, make sure it's an NS object. So if it was a UI view, that'd be more of a core graphics type stuff. But the NS object is just an object. We're going to call this a motor. And go ahead and create that. And now you see that I have this motor.m that I'm in. I'm going to go ahead and click on motor.h. I'm going to put a few of these items. So for example, so you're in motor.h, and we basically need is on, velocity, and direction. So let's go ahead and do is on. So at property bool is on. Okay, if we look at this, if we create classes, usually we have a capital letter for the class. So when you name a file, use capital letters. When you're using variables and method names, you usually start with a lowercase, and that's just a common kind of structure that's in a lot of programming for Apple devices. So this at property bool, a bool is yes or no, is on. So it could be true or false. Well, basically yes or no. The velocity, let's do that as a float. So at property float velocity. Oops. Now we keep on using this at property, that gets the getter and setter. So we can actually get and set these values, which is useful. And then the direction, let's go ahead and do this as a bool. Change this up a little bit. I'm going to say clockwise. So we can do an if clockwise, else do this. So we can choose whether the direction is clockwise or counterclockwise. Basically two options for a motor. Now we have this method called change direction. It's probably not going to return anything, so we're going to do a minus void change direction and semicolon. Alright, so now we got our motor.h. And let's go ahead and create our quadricopter. So I'm going to right click, new file. It's going to be Objective-C class. I'm going to go ahead and do next. I'm going to call it a quadrocopter. Go ahead and do next. Create. And I'm going to go to quadrocopter.h. I'm going to have my motors, so my motors are in an array. So I'm going to do at property, and this is going to be our first pointer. So I'm going to do non-atomic, strong, ns array, star, motors. So that's going to be an array of these motor objects. If I want to actually use those, though, I do need to import them. So I'm going to say pound import. I'm going to say motor.h. And now it'll let us actually to use any of those motors later on. And if you put it in the header file, you can use it in the .m file as well. So that's kind of a handy feature. We have a controller, which I didn't really specify a controller too much. Let's go ahead and create one of those real quick. So I'm gonna, right click. I'm gonna right click, choose new file, Objective C class. I'm gonna go do next. I'm gonna make a controller. Next. I don't know quite what my controller is gonna be, but we can go ahead and create it. So now I got this controller and my quadricopter. I'm going to import my controller as well. So I'm going to do pound import controller. And now we can add our controller to our quadricopter by doing @property non-atomic strong. And I'm going to say controller star main controller. So basically we just created this controller and now we're using this object. And when we create our NS array, we're going to create a bunch of these motor objects and add it to that array. And then the final thing we got to do is add some of these methods. So minus void, and we're going to say hover minus void move direction. I'm going to do a colon to specify that I want to pass a parameter, and I'm going to say it's an int and direction. So we can use an int, say like 1 is north, 2 is east, all that kind of stuff. And then minus void, find path. Oops. And I'm going to modify this one quite a bit. I'm going to say from. I'm going to do a CG point. So these are handy little tools that we're going to use a bunch. We use them a lot for views and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to say start point to CG point. And I should actually, you want to write these out so that they're really long, so that they make sense. So they need to be descriptive. Before the 2, we're actually press enter. And point. And you can see we can actually line them up with those colons. So the name of this method is actually called find a path from point to point. You don't actually read these out loud, you just read the left side. And what that lets us know is basically you give this method 2 objects, so 2 points, and then the helicopter is going to try to find the distance between those 2 points, find the direction it will go. And then the last one, we'll do a bool on this one. We're going to say start communication with, and we're going to call another quadricopter. So I'm going to say quadrocopter. Oops. Star. Other chopper. Alright, so it's kind of weird. We're in a quadricopter and we have a method that calls another quadricopter. So it's kind of an interesting thing you can do with objects. Even though this is one instance of a quadricopter, it can talk to any other one and then make decisions based off that communication. So The very powerful thing about object-oriented programming is in that video, those helicopters were in control of themselves. There wasn't an individual program that was just overseeing it all to an extent that it dictated all the commands to every helicopter. Each helicopter had a basic idea of what to do, but it used its own mind kind of to control how it would navigate through the world and work together with other helicopters. So object-oriented programming, it makes everything go much more expanded, much more powerful. It's a beautiful thing. Alright, so that'll get you started with creating these classes. For your checkpoint, we're going to have you create classes similar to these off of different objects.